Hello everyone, and welcome to another IT seminar. Today we have a very special guest, Professor Eric Miller, who will be providing us useful information and tips about report writing. A brief introduction of Professor Eric Miller. All of you know him, but he is the director of University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute. He has chaired many TRB committees and has chaired or been a member of numerous intercity travel demand modeling peer review panels. Recently, he received a University of Toronto Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering Safwat Zaky Research Leader Award. Professor Miller is the developer of GTAModel, a state-of-the-art activity-based microsimulation model, which is used by GTHA authorities. And he also developed ILUTE model, which is an integrated land use travel demand model system for the GTHA. I think Professor Eric, he is the expert in the field, and we would love to hear from him. Professor Eric Miller, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Usman. And everybody can still see my screen, right? The title page. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, Usman, for that introduction, for inviting me here. This is a talk I do probably about every 2 years or so in the seminar series. People keep getting asked back, so I guess it's of some help to people. And I'm certainly not going to be talking about travel demand modeling today, but we're going, as the title implies, I'm going to talk about report writing because we're in a business where communication is absolutely essential. You all are, at a minimum, going to have to write a thesis. Most of you will be also writing conference papers, journal papers about your work. Once you leave here, you're going to go either into the profession, consulting, or government, where inevitably you're going to be writing technical reports, or you're going to go into academia, where you live and die by publications and so forth. So writing effectively is absolutely as essential a skill to us as whatever technical, mathematical, computational skills we have, as important as whatever substantive knowledge we have about our about transportation and so forth. Because if we can't communicate what we know and what we've done, it's useless. If the tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, what's the meaning of the event? So report writing is extraordinarily important, and we learn by doing. There's no other way around it. And by taking courses, and certainly what I'm going to be saying in the next 45 minutes or so. It doesn't begin to scratch the surface on how to really write effectively. And for many of you, I know many of you have or are taking some of the technical report writing courses the faculty offers. They're excellent. I would strongly encourage everybody, if you haven't, and if you have any concerns about your writing at all, it's well worth taking one or more of these courses. Also, and to be frank, a large number of you, English is not your first language, and so I have huge admiration for people who work in multiple languages. I always say I barely speak English and I'm able to work in English. So I think it has to be an additional challenge to be working in another language. I don't know how difficult it is to learn Mandarin or Punjabi or whatever, even German, French, but I suspect English is a difficult language to learn because, sort of like the English people and English government itself, the English language is very fluid, very flexible. It has rules, and the rules are often there to be broken. It's a fairly irregular language, and I suspect this is true of almost any language. The way we speak it and the way we write it is sometimes a bit different, and to be really fluent, I think, in any language, one has to achieve a certain comfort level with it. The rules have to become second nature, but also the notion of when can you bend the rules? When is it effective writing to bend a rule? And that can only be learned by doing, by writing. I would also say by reading. all of you are reading, I'm sure, a lot of technical papers, and that's very good because you see the style and you see, how to write a technical paper. I would encourage you to read fiction, read nonfiction. I would, particularly if English is not your first language, to be reading widely in English, because I think by osmosis, by reading, by seeing how good writers write, I think that helps get the cadence, get the feel for the language, which I think could be very useful. In any event, with that preamble, what I want to do is go through, and as we'll see, I talk about a lot of little things that I think add up to be helpful, hopefully, in how we put reports together. And the way I've organized this is I've actually written this report. So this document, I'm just going to go through it, and I've tried in putting this document together to follow my own rules, my own guidance, to illustrate through the document itself what I think is good report writing. Marshall McLuhan, who was a very famous professor here at U of T a long time ago now, he was a professor of communications. He always said the medium is the message, and this is one of his famous quotes. And so how you style and format and organize your document and the language you use is the medium by which you're trying to convey your message. And I think that is important. So I'm just going to be kind of drifting through this report and hopefully and talking about things and hoping to illustrate what I think is good form. And I'll also say that, some of this is style. So, I have my style, the font I like, et cetera, et cetera. I would not impose that on anybody, I hope. So again, part of good writing is to find your own style. How are you comfortable presenting things on the page? And so, so what we're trying to do in this talk and in this document, and I'll share this document, I'll send it to Usman after and we can post it, is just to try to talk through some of the issues I've seen students struggle with. I've mentioned English as second language. Native-born English speakers don't necessarily do things any better sometimes, I find. So this is something I hope is useful to everybody one way or the other. And you can see already that I have my front pages and so forth set up. And so what I want to talk about in this report, in this talk, is a few words in each of these areas. Report organization. How do you actually organize a report? How do you set it up structurally? I will say some things about style, and that's where I'm going to, and then just how we work with tables, figures, and so forth. One of the themes throughout this talk and this document is consistency, regardless of what the style is, regardless of how you decide to organize things. Be consistent. Be consistent in how you label figures. Be consistent in your use of tense. Be consistent in all sorts of variety of ways. It sounds simple. It's not as easy as it sounds sometimes, particularly when you're in the midst of a big report. Be consistent in how you reference things, because I think part of writing a good report is to make it easy for the reader to read it. You want to make it easy for the reader to understand what you're saying. You need to be clear in what you're saying, but again, the actual format on the page, the fact that you are consistent and so forth helps the reader. Anything that's jarring to the reader, if you're inconsistent in how you're referencing figures, or you're inconsistent in the use of tense, these are little disturbances to the reader. They're distractions to the reader that similar if you're making a lot of simple grammatical mistakes. These are distractions to the reader that get in the way of your message. And this is part of what I'm trying to convey here, is ways of being consistent in hopefully good ways. So certainly report organization is very important. Every report is a story. You're trying to convey a message, a narrative to people. So what that story has to make sense to people. It has to flow from beginning to end. It has to be motivated. It has to tell people what they're expecting, what they're hoping to hear, and so forth. So I think a key thing in organization is always that there's sort of three. Always, even a one-page summary of something, I think to a certain extent, there's three components. I always say you should, in any report, you should tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them that they've been told. So in other words, you need to introduce and motivate whatever it is you're presenting. You then have to have the main body of the report or the paper where you're actually providing the content. And then you need some sort of summary conclusion to remind people of what the main findings are or the conclusions are. So again, making it easy for the reader to know how to understand that logic, understand the flow of what you're telling them, why you're telling them, and so forth. In setting up any report or paper, you want to think about, you want to use sections, there's different parts to a paper. And I think a starting point, whether it's for a big thesis or a 20-minute presentation, is think through those parts. What is the flow? What are the things I have to include? So in particularly any sort of major report like a thesis, there should be a title page. If this is a journal paper, it doesn't have title pages, but a technical report, a thesis will have a title page, title, author, date, that sort of thing. It should have an executive summary or abstract up front. It should have a table of contents, list of figures, so people can look at that table of contents and get some sense of the flow. And again, then you have a number of sections in the report or the paper. You introduce the topic, you motivate it, provide any background you need. Usually there's a literature review. Usually you have to discuss methods in our field, data, results, and so forth. And so just talking about, this is not the way every report will be organized, but the point is every report, every paper should have a very clear logical organization. Sections and section headings, chapter headings, whatever, are very important to help break up and display that logic to people. Oh, I'm now in section 3 and it's going to talk about modeling methods. I understand where I am. I mean, I sometimes see, those of you who take my grad courses, there's always a report or two, a literature review or whatever needs to be written, provided. Sometimes we'll get a 10-page paper where there are no headings. It just starts off. And maybe there's maybe the words are very, the actual words on the page are very well organized and they flow. But but without, section 1, introduction, section 2, literature review, it's very, it's still hard for the reader to deduce, oh, I'm transitioning from this to that, or here's my flow. So making good use of section headings and labeling really helps you organize your thoughts, but also for the reader to see. So again, if we go through these various components, title page, if appropriate, technical reports generally will have an executive summary. Theses and journal papers will have a abstract. It's the same thing. It's a very brief, very concise summary up front, telling the reader what this report or paper is about, and it's very important. For many reasons, and you've probably already experienced this if you've been involved in any sort of literature review. The first thing you do is you read the abstract to, as much as anything, to decide, do I want to read the rest of this paper? What's this about? Is this important to me? And or to prepare you for, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds interesting. Let's go. This is what I'm expecting to hear. Particularly out in industry or government, the decision maker, your boss, whatever, the mayor, not that the mayor probably reads much, the only thing they may read is the executive summary, and they'll leave it to, people further down the food chain to actually read the details. So executive summaries in technical reports are extremely important to get the message across. What was this about? What's the key findings? What's the key recommendations? So the executive summary out in the field can often be the most important 2 pages you write in this entire 100-page report, because maybe that's the thing that some key people are going to read and nothing else. Introductions should be short and sweet. They should be to the point. They should literally be introducing the topic. I often tell my students, that the best way to start a thesis is the very first sentence to say, the objective of this thesis is ... So right up front, you tell people, what is it that this is about? Maybe a brief motivation, but if that motivation is going to take too long, put it in another section. So the idea of the introduction is literally to introduce what you're trying to say, and then provide a bit of a roadmap to what's coming ahead. So maybe you have a paragraph or two introducing the topic and its objectives, and then again, very common report or thesis. The remainder of the thesis or the report is organized this way. Chapter 2 will deal with this. Chapter 3 will deal with this. Chapter 4. So it's almost like in words, the table of contents, just in one paragraph. So again, the reader has a clear sense of here's how it's organized as we're going forward. Literature reviews are, in our field, are almost universal. Almost any sort of research or even technical report usually requires a literature review, because the literature review defines the point of departure for whatever we're doing. What is already known about this, and then how, and then we're going to build on top of it, or we're going to make use of what's already known to do something. Very often, literature review is a standalone section or chapter. Sometimes it makes sense, however, I think, to actually break the literature review up and do it in chunks. But this is particularly the case, perhaps, in a thesis or in a big report, where maybe some of the literature relates to the modeling methods we're using. And some of the literature refers to maybe data collection, and some refers to current previous findings in the field, and so instead of having a chapter dealing with all this holistically, which you then find you're constantly referring back to when you get to methods and data and results, sometimes it makes sense to in the methods section have a review of the methods, and in the data section have a review of of the literature on data and so forth. How you organize this really depends on the nature of the report, what you're dealing with, what makes sense in terms of, again, a good flow and an easy way for people to assimilate things. So there's certain information about the literature you want to convey to your reader. How best is that to do that? And another very general rule, I think, in report writing is ideally the organization of the report, the flow, writes itself in a sense that as you're writing it, it becomes clear to you how best to organize it. And sometimes you may start out thinking like, well, for example, I'm going to have chapter 2 is literature review. And then as you're writing the other chapters, you realize, I'm constantly sending the reader back to chapter 2 and I'm repeating what I've said there because I have to say it here again as I'm talking about my methods. Well, maybe nice thing about word processors, it's easy to copy and paste. Maybe I do break up that chapter and have chunks of it in different places, because it just it reduces the amount of repetitiveness in my discussions. It reduces the amount of time I have to be referring back to things I've already said, and so forth. I'm not saying that's the way one should do it in all cases or in many cases, but it's just illustrating that, again, how you organize whatever it is you're writing. Be conscious of it as you're putting things together, and be willing to rearrange things a little bit to get that nice smooth flow wherever possible. There's also, another couple of things is just in the sequence, the logical sequence, do we talk about our modeling methods first, or do we talk about the data we're going to use for implementation first? which comes which. Again, there's no perfect order there. It really depends on the problem. If the modeling methods you choose are completely driven by the data you have, it probably makes sense to discuss the data first and then say, well, given my available data, here's what I'm going to do to analyze it. Very often, we're very methodologically oriented. We're maybe the focus is developing new methods. So we really want to talk about that first. And then, and here's some data that we're using to implement that method. So, the order depends on again, the details of, the exposition, the narrative we're trying to tell. Similarly, it's very common you see templates for technical reports where there's a results section and then there's a discussion session. And if you're, if you were chemical engineers and you're describing your laboratory methods, results, discussion, the results are all shown and then you discuss them in a separate section, that may work fine. And that can work fine in our field too. But what I've always found is the sorts of modeling we're doing, the sorts of that usually I find having a results and discussion together in a section. You present the table of parameters for your nested logit model and you discuss it on the spot. Because again, I think it's often very artificial and a bit aggravating to the reader to, in section 5, here's this table of parameters. And then in section 6, you start discussing them. And to me, that's not a very organic way of dealing with things. And again, all reports should end with summary conclusions, often future work. And the point of that is to literally summarize the key findings, maybe a real brief reprise of here's what we did. In this study, we did, this was the objective and this is what we did, like in 1 or 2 sentences. And then we found these following 3 major things. So it is summary, it's conclusions. You should not be introducing new material. It'd be very rare that there should be a reference, a citation in a conclusion because this should be a summary. You should not be introducing new ideas here. You're wrapping up and driving home. Here's what we found. Here's why this is important. And just finally, in terms of organization, as I said, sectioning off, dividing up your report in a logical way really does, I think, require a hierarchical level of section headings and so forth. Many different styles here, and Microsoft Word comes with all sorts of different heading styles and this sort of thing. Sometimes you use different fonts and different colors and bold, italic, bold and italic, etc., etc. And so one way or the other, you have to have a very clear, consistent sectioning. I really, really like numbering and the sort of the hierarchical type numbering you have here, because without the numbers, it's easy in a big document to kind of forget, well, bold and italics, what level is that in the thing versus just bold or caps or just italics. I think having that numbering scheme really helps you to, for readers to keep track of, how deep in the nesting in the sectioning am I, and knowing that we're going to climb out again eventually. I think there's a limit. I don't usually try to go beyond, let's say, 3 levels. Beyond this, the next thing might be just, if there's something else, just italics at the start of a little title, at the start of a paragraph or something. Again, this is style. But again, the key thing is to be structured, and that structure should be clear and navigable by people. Okay, probably too long on that. Style. Style is very important. At the end of the day, it is your style. It's for you to choose within certain boundaries your style in terms of fonts, line spacing, how you handle paragraphs, how you handle citations, and so forth. In many cases, however, or in all cases, you have to be aware of who you're writing for, and as much as who's in a sense publishing this, because very often there are style guides, there are templates you need to follow. So if you're writing a paper for TRB, TRB has their template, and you must use their fonts, you must use, their rules about figures and tables and citations, so forth. Virtually every journal is the same way. Here's the format we want things in, here's the typeface, the font size, etc., etc. Even your thesis, the Department of Civil Engineering has a template. So if you know who you're writing for, you should start right from the beginning with that template, because you're just going to have to convert it. I mean, sometimes when we're writing journal papers, we start off and we may not know what journal it's going to, and so, but you want to choose a style in any event that's clear, conveys things, and be consistent in the choice of that. In terms of general, let's say, writing style, which again is very individual and everybody has to find their own style, I think a few very high level comments is technical report writing should be concise. You are not writing War and Peace. You're not writing a novel. You should say what needs to be said, certainly no less, but certainly no more. Verbosity is not a virtue. Padding things, to make it look big and flowery is not good. On the other hand, you don't want to be, more terse than you. You can be overly terse. I sometimes find in first drafts, particularly of theses, for students, that they leave things out. They know what they did. The professor knows what they did. So why do I have to talk about it? But you need to, particularly in a thesis, you have to, even though the professor knows you know it, you have to tell the professor you know it. So you have to show your steps, show your reasoning in quite a bit of detail, particularly in a thesis. Papers, journal papers, are more of a challenge. You're writing for a technical audience. You very often are under increasingly severe word or page limits. So it's a real challenge, I think, to decide what do I need to include and what not. Do I really have to tell my audience, write out the equation for a multinomial logit model anymore? Or do I have to define its derivation? Probably not. But it is a bit of an art to decide, particularly in journal papers, exactly what needs to be included or not. But the general rule is still say what needs to be said, but don't say any, don't elaborate on it. You're not being paid by the word. Your grade doesn't depend on how many words, how many pages. Avoid long sentences and long paragraphs. Keep points sharp and clear. Again, it's easier for the reader to read a simple sentence than a long sentence. I must confess, after all these years, this is one of the things that sometimes it's do what I say, not what I do. Because if I have, I'm sure I have lots of problems with my own writing still. I sometimes write pretty long sentences, compound sentences, and where possible, I come back if I have time and I'll edit it and break them up. Short sentences are definitely preferred. Be descriptive but not flowery. Avoid rhetoric and polemics. I think this is extremely important. I think we're seeing, and I think in engineering, this is not yet a problem. I've just finished reviewing a PhD thesis for a person who will be unnamed and a university unnamed. I found it highly polemical, highly ideological. Maybe this makes sense in their discipline, but I don't think we should be seeing this in engineering. We should be objective and calm in our discussions. That's not to say that our work does not have, for example, political and social implications. I think there's ways of in my own personal view, that we can be talking about this without engaging in polemics, particularly. Something I advocate quite strongly is I think we should write in the present tense, and I'll talk more about this later wherever possible. I also personally think one should, in technical writing, write in the third person. Don't that it's not I and we. It's one can observe or it is observed. So it's sort of the passive third person. I think is good technical style. We're seeing increasingly a tendency to go to the first person. I did this, we did that. This, my view is this. There's a place for that, particularly if we're talking about opinions. I still think it's again, sort of to have this more objective, measured presentation. I think it's more professional, but again, that's a style thing that does change. Again, I think just how you present on the page in terms of font size and font type is useful, but again, there's many possibilities there. Paragraph spacing, you can see my preference is no indent and a space between paragraphs, or you could indent, in which case you probably don't need a space, but again, be consistent and make it easy for people to see the organization of paragraphs. Grammar and syntax. And apologies if I'm rushing a little bit here, but there is, those of you who have me in class know I could talk forever, so I'm trying to get through these things. This is really nitty-gritty, but this is where I actually think a lot of the very practical problems students run into is just with really elemental parts of how you write a sentence and the words we use. I was just we have the professors have a section meeting every Friday just before this, and we were talking about how much time we spend editing first drafts of our students and dealing with these sort of grammar and syntax problems before we get to the content. And this sounds kind of nitty-gritty and petty, but it's not, because again, you're writing something to convey a message. What's important is the content. But if the reader is constantly stumbling over, maybe very small typos, grammatical errors, I mean, sometimes it's just typos, just sloppy editing. But sometimes there are these sort of systematic grammatical problems. It gets in the way of the message. Again, the medium is the message, and if you can't discern the message because you're constantly, even in your mind, just editing the sentence, so you can understand it. This is very difficult. So next couple of minutes, I'm going to be, as I say, really down in the weeds, but and again, the only way to get better at these things is through practice, but it is surprisingly important. So I'm going to talk about three things: singular and plural tenses, the use of articles, and the use of the use of tense. So singular and plural. First of all, so every noun is either singular, a unitary thing, or plural. There's a bunch of them. Every sentence has a noun and a verb. So there's a subject, a noun subject, an agent, somebody, something, does something, the verb. There's an action. So a subject with action, right? Noun, verb. Nouns and verbs have to be consistent. If the noun is singular, the verb has to be singular. If the noun is plural, the verb must be plural. Otherwise, it's a jarring mixed message going on. So we have to be consistent. This for people, particularly coming out of certain other language backgrounds, this can be very challenging, because maybe in your home language, it's singular and plural have very different concepts or whatever. One way to help with this consistency is keeping sentences short. If the noun and the verb are close together, it's usually easier to see that when you have an inconsistency. I have my issues with Microsoft Word in some ways, but one thing, the editing feature should always be turned on in Word. So, and the squiggly little blue lines you get under a verb typically when it's inconsistent with the noun, Word's pretty good at catching this, is really very helpful. But Word doesn't always catch it, particularly if the noun and the verb are far enough apart. You have sort of a compound, complicated sentence. There may be a mismatch. Again, there's no good way of really getting good at this, except by being conscious of the issue and, just really trying to pay attention to this until it really does become second nature. And I don't know whether this is helpful or not, but my suggestion kind of is that, one way of sort of thinking about this issue is think of some really simple sentences. So the example, the stick are light. Stick is singular, are is plural. It should be the stick is light. The sticks is in the box, the other way around. Sticks are plural, it should be are. So again, this is just something one has to keep beating away at until it becomes easier to get it right off the bat. The second related issue is, should the noun be singular or plural? Have we chosen the right way of expressing the noun? So in this first sentence, maybe you really didn't mean to say the sticks are light. You actually meant to refer to a bunch of sticks, but you use the singular noun instead. So maybe it's a typo or it's a mistake on the noun side, not the verb side. I guess that's another way of putting it. So again, one has to be, am I talking about a group of things, plural, or I'm talking about a singular thing? The second one, which is also just, I know drives a lot of students crazy, are articles. My impression of this is maybe the single biggest problem many students have. We just have these two little articles, or a, or an if it's in front of a vowel, and the or the. But dealing with these two simple, stupid little words is really challenging. And this ties into singular and plural. The usage of the articles ties directly into the question of singular versus plural. Generally, in English, singular nouns always should have an article. And I'll talk about exceptions or big exceptions. So a or and the, both words, can both be used as singular articles. A is used when to modify or refer to a singular noun, which is generic, general, non-specific example of whatever the object is the noun's representing, whereas the or the is used when referring to a particular specific example. So again, a couple of very simplistic examples. A stick is a piece of wood. This is, so what this, in the sentence, stick here could be any stick. We're not talking about a specific stick. We're just talking generally that a stick is, again, a piece of wood. It could be any piece of wood, as opposed to, just another arbitrary sentence. The stick he carved from the leftover wood is missing. So here we're referring to a specific stick, the one whoever he is, carved, and it came from a specific piece of wood, the leftover wood. So the is always specific. So one thing that might help a little bit in some cases is the, which is kind of pointing to a specific item, is in many respects synonymous with this stick. So the stick, this stick. If it's, if it is this stick we're talking about, then the is appropriate. Well, a usually connotes any and often could be replaced with any as a modifier. And so, I sort of, the geek in me, I love object orientation. So sort of translating this rule is that the generic article is used to modify a class, any stick, all sticks. Well, the modifies it. This class, this stick. I don't know if that helps anybody or not. Now, exceptions. Singular nouns can stand alone without an article if, in one case, if they're already being modified by the equivalent, something else. So one example is I write one example of this is demonstrated by this sentence. I don't say an example. Example doesn't require an adjective because an article, because the adjective one is modifying it. The other primary example is if there is only one instance of the class, if there is only one element of this, then the general and the specific are the same. So as an example, English is the language this document is written in. There is only one English language. There's not, I mean, there's all sorts of dialects and variants, but English is the unitary language. We don't have to say the English or an English. It's just English. It doesn't need a modifier because it stands alone. Quoting Marx, religion is the opiate of the masses. Religion, I mean, there's many religions, but here he's talking about the generic class of religions instead. So it's not the religion or a religion, it's all religions. It doesn't need modifying. A stick is a piece of wood. Wood isn't modified because, again, we're using it in a very generic way. So it's either there is only one instance of this, like English, or we are talking about an absolute generic, in a sense, abstraction of all wood, all religions, and so forth. Okay, so that's singular, singular articles. On the plural side, the is the only plural article. So the does double duty, and maybe this is part of the confusion people get into. The is used both for specific instances of a singular object, but it's also applied to plural nouns. A is never used to modify plural nouns, never ever. And as with singular nouns, the modifies specific instances. So general, the general abstract, non-specific case of plural nouns doesn't require an article. So sticks shorter than 2 meters are no good for building the bridge. Sticks, we're talking about any sticks, it doesn't need a modifier. We wouldn't say the sticks shorter than 2 meters because we're not pointing towards specific sticks in this case. But the bridge, this person is talking about a specific bridge, so it's also singular, so we need the article. Bring, as opposed to bring me the long sticks that are piled outside. So here we're pointing towards a specific set of long sticks, so we need the article. So, again, practice makes perfect. Really, this requires getting to the point where when you're reading the sentence in your head or you're writing it, it sounds right. And it's getting to that point that's challenging. I think I always end this topic with talking about a former PhD student who will remain absolutely nameless and has gone on to marvelous things and writes books and all sorts of things. But he confessed at the time he was writing his PhD thesis that he would just allocate himself 10 does per page and attach some he claimed randomly to nouns on that page and hope that someone would be right. So I'm not sure that's the best way to learn how to do things, and I hope that's not, I would not recommend that to anybody, but it just illustrates this is even though it's so nitty gritty and so detailed, it's tough. I recognize it. Tense, I've already said that I think, and different people will have different styles here, I think technical reports should basically be written in the present tense because this report is. It doesn't matter, I wrote my PhD thesis, unfortunately, decades ago, but that thesis, that content, that thesis still is. It exists on a shelf someplace, gathering dust. The material in it exists in the present forever, as long as that thesis is still available. So, so anything written is forever. So I think it's generally we should use the present tense. So as I say, the objective of this paper is to provide students with guidance in report writing. And it wasn't the fact that I wrote this a while ago doesn't matter. Similarly, when we're writing and we're talking about particularly what's coming ahead, like an introduction and so forth, it seems very natural to say, section 2 will talk about this. And that's okay if you're consistent with that. But I would argue it's better to say section 2 discusses this, because again, the reason the future tense there sounds natural is because we haven't gotten there yet, and we read in a linear way. But in fact, section 2 contains material. Notice the present tense there, contains material, whether you read it or not, and whether you skip over or whether you haven't read it yet, that content is there, and this is what it contains. So I think in general, the present tense just makes a lot of sense. Now, there are times when it becomes, totally awkward. And again, it should be fairly apparent when you want to use a future or past tense. One clear example where past tense is I think important is when you're describing something you did, like an experiment. So this is what we did to get the results that are presented in section 5. So I think describing actual specific actions like this, like we did this survey last year, we gathered this data, we ran this experiment. So talking about specific actions in the past should be in past tense. So again, as one example with experiments, if the instructions for the experiment will be in the present tense. They say, take 1 liter of water and mix it, or whatever, because the instruction exists. But then if you're describing what you do, then maybe you would say, if you're having, again, a narrative of what went on, we next mixed 1 liter of water with, because you're describing something you did. Again, hopefully this is of some help. And I notice I'm getting close to the hour. And so, but I think I'm reaching near the end. Tables, figures, exhibits, appendices. I think the big thing here is be consistent. If this is the way you talk about figures, always use that. Don't say figure 1 on 1 page and then fig decimal period 2 on the next page, that sort of thing. I think. And then another thing that is important. It's also a bit of a pet peeve of mine, but is pay attention to spelling. British English is different than American English in certain cases. The two biggest ones are the OUR versus OR, double L versus single L, and to a lesser extent, the S versus Z in certain words. Pay attention to where your audience is. If you're writing for an American journal or conference like TRB, use American spelling. If you're most international journals follow British spelling. So if you're writing for transportation, or I think transportation, many of the journals, international journals, they will follow British spelling. Canadian English, classically Canadian, is a mixture of both, but correct Canadian English is OUR and double L. I strongly believe any thesis written at the University of Toronto should use that spelling. We are completely confused and mixed up when it comes to S and Z. You can use either is acceptable, but be consistent. So yeah, don't maximize with a Z on one page and minimize with an S on the next. I actually tend to use a Z because I grew up near the American border. It somehow just looks better to me. But be consistent in your thing. Also, just again, it's in Canada, it's Z, not Z. I had maybe I can take just a minute. When I was a TA at MIT doing my PhD, I was TAing a Fortran programming course. If you can believe people once programmed in Fortran, and this student who happened to be from Georgia had a nice Southern accent came in to me, and he's having problems with his program. And one of my idiosyncrasies is just to differentiate in my handwriting between a 2 and a Z. I would use the European convention of putting a little, horizontal bar through the Z. So I was just writing on a paper. I said, well, let's let Y equal X plus Z. And I just come down to the States, and I was very Canadian. I was insisting that I would say Z instead of Z. And the student, he just looked at me and says, tell me something. Is a Z a Z with a slash through it? And I said, no, it's Z. And from there on in, I said Z while I was in the States. But we're in Canada, so let's try to say Z. Anyway, Other things, do not use contractions in technical report writing. It's sloppy. Don't use, again, it's conventional, but we generally will just use words for small numbers, numerals for large numbers. But again, it depends on what, if you're reporting, the result, of my test was, the answer is 2, I'll write 2. I don't think we need to talk about these things. Yeah, avoid slang or overly casual language. Be precise. Use technical words. Don't use slang. Well, maybe you can read this because I've reached the hour and we need to stop. But data, methodology, and parameter are words I think we should be careful with. Data is plural. I've given up on this one. Everybody says data is this, and methodology. Method is the study of methods, not methods. Both of these are Americanisms that have just completely overwhelmed us. But parameter is something I would insist upon. Y equals A plus BX. A and B are parameters. X and Y are variables. They are not parameters. And I think it's very important that we understand what a parameter is, a coefficient, and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because I'm past the hour.